When I started writing the script for this video, I wanted to focus on analyzing the political career of Joe Biden. But as I started reading about him and writing out some initial thoughts, my mind started to wander to other things. Biden is, at the end of the day, responsible for what he did throughout his career and the genocide that he supported at the end of it. But Biden didn't come out of nowhere. He has been part of the American political system for decades, and that system and the people that participate in it have elevated him to the highest position in the United States government. I was not a political kid growing up at all. When I was super young, I was in an environment where my thoughts were basically, okay, the Republicans are the good guys and the Democrats are the bad ones. And then when I got to high school and Trump was elected, the perspective shifted to, okay, the Democrats are the good ones and the Republicans are the bad ones. But I also didn't really understand why. Sure, I got some of the surface level criticisms people had of the Republican Party, but I always thought to myself there has to be something deeper going on here. Why are the Democrats the good ones? And as I've gotten older and watched more and more how these two sides interact with each other online, in the news, and while in office, I've come to realize that actions don't actually mean that much in mainstream political discourse. If you'll allow me to play the centrist for a moment here, take a look at how both sides present themselves to their voter base. Both the Democrats and the Republicans present themselves as a working class party. Both the Democrats and the Republicans portray themselves as the party of personal liberty. Both Democrats and Republicans accuse each other of being communists. I think, broadly speaking, to the American liberal mainstream and the European liberal mainstream, the Democrats are seen as a counterweight to the more openly racist, chauvinistic, and nationalist Republican Party. In the last few decades, Democrats seem to be defined by everything they are not. If Americans were tired of the Vietnam War and of Nixon, then the Democrats would bring out Jimmy Carter, the so-called humanitarian president who wins the Nobel Peace Prize. If people were tired of Reaganomics and the deficit spending had been raised to trillions of dollars under Reagan and Bush Sr., the Democrats would bring out Bill Clinton to fix the budget and focus on social services. If people were tired of the wars under Bush Jr., then the Democrats would bring out Obama, who promised change. And when Americans got tired of Trump, the political outsider who will just say anything that's on his mind, the Democrats would bring in Biden, the career politician who, after 50 years of public service, worked his way to the top. Of course, none of these people actually did what voters thought they would do. Carter was not a humanitarian. Clinton fixed the budget by cutting millions in welfare, education, and healthcare. Obama was not a massive change. And Biden, the sensible guy brought in because Trump couldn't be trusted, committed a genocide. But no matter how many times this cycle continues to go round and round, Americans cannot seem to break out of it. But how did we get to this status quo? Well, when talking about the development of the Democratic Party, I could talk about its origins, how it was founded on the doctrine of manifest destiny, not just a supporter of, but an active participant in the genocide of Native Americans. But I'm gonna start the story in 1854, when the Democratic Party's eternal main opponent, the Republican Party, was formed. Leading up to the Civil War, American capitalists were split into two main groups. In the North were the industrialists, and in the South, the plantation owners. Since these two groups started forming in their respective halves, they were able to develop side by side, generally speaking, without many problems. But by the 1830s onwards, contradictions would start to form within the United States. Both the northern industrialists and the southern plantation owners had gotten so big that they were beginning to compete for the same markets. The North wanted to industrialize the US, and especially all the newly conquered territory in the West, and in order to more effectively grow the developing northern economy, implement tariffs and more protectionist policies to develop their industry without exposing it to the chaos that is the free market. The South opposed these policies because it would have made it more expensive to import foreign manufactured goods, and also because the tariffs would have likely resulted in other countries putting tariffs on the US, meaning that they would make less money selling cotton. Cotton in the US was not just one export out of many, it was the export. Leading up to the Civil War, cotton alone made up more than 50% of the entire US export market, and the slaves that were necessary labor to grow and pick the cotton made up more than an estimated $3 billion in capital, which was more money than was invested in banks, manufacturing, and railroads combined for the time. If slavery were to continue existing and to continue growing, the slave economy of the South would no longer just be a way of getting cheap raw cotton to northern industrialists, but rather an existential threat. So, leading up to the Civil War, America was in this place in which the southern slave owners and the northern industrialists had diametrically opposed interests, and whatever was going to win was going to be able to take control of the way that the new land in the West would be developed. It was this discontent for the slave economy from northern industrialists that eventually led to the founding of the Republican Party, and it was the election of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, that would lead the southern slave owning states to secede, which would lead to the Civil War. I hope until this point I've done a good enough explanation of the conflict between American capitalists to expel the myth that Lincoln and the Republicans fought against the South and slavery because of moral reasons, and instead fought it for the same reason that Americans fight every war, which is to make money. While some Northerners were certainly morally opposed to slavery, it was not this moral objection that led the North into conflict with the South, and it was not on moral principles that people joined the military. Northern industrialists were completely fine with slavery to a point, but capitalism doesn't work like that. It tends to grow and grow. Slavery was a good way of getting raw cotton to northern industry for cheap. The problem only became existential when it became clear that the growing slave economy was going to actively harm the industrializing North. This is why Lincoln's original plan was to abolish slavery only in the newly conquered territories in the West and not in the states where slavery was already present. The Civil War was about capitalist accumulation of wealth, and the complete abolition of slavery was only taken when it became clear that as long as a dual slave-owning economy was going to exist in the US, it would be a threat to industrialization. This sentiment is, I think, perfectly summarized in a letter written during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln himself. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. As we all know, the Confederates would lose the war, and slavery was abolished. Following the end of the war, former slave owners and members of the Confederate Army, the vast majority of them being Democrats, were banned from holding public office because the northern states didn't want them to reorganize and to try to bring them back to the situation that had led them to the Civil War. This is kind of a detour, but I just wanted to point out some parallels here. If another country had a civil war which had one class of people overthrowing another class of people, and then that class decided to prevent the other class from joining the government and organizing politically or trying to start another civil war, I think most Americans and Europeans would call that authoritarianism. And I find it extremely hypocritical and ironic that the very same tactics that are condemned by Americans when other countries use them to defend their own social revolutions are praised in American classrooms as democracy persevering when America does it. But I'm getting off topic, that is a subject for another video. In this period of time in which slave owners and Confederate Army veterans were no longer allowed to be in the government, the American economy changed rapidly. Slavery was now abolished, and industrialization was happening faster than ever before. So while Democrats had retreated to lick their wounds, they would emerge in the 20th century with a new position within the American political system. Since the election of Abraham Lincoln, it would be 24 years until another Democrat would be elected into office. With slavery illegal, the party support base shifted towards bankers who supported their more laissez-faire economic policies, businesses involved in railroads, transportation, and agriculture, as well as some of these same Southern elites who had previously been plantation owners. So, although the Republicans and the Democrats did still represent different business interests, this was not an irreconcilable difference between two combating economies that would lead to a civil war, but rather disagreements between two groups of capitalists with the same business interests who disagreed on which would be the best way to continue developing. In addition, in the 24 years of only Republican presidents, the US had industrialized, and the conditions of the American working class, which had grown significantly since the end of the Civil War, were deteriorating. Long workdays were common, pay was low, rent was high, child labor was normal, and fatal workplace accidents were frequent. From around the 1870s up until the end of the Great Depression, strikes and protests for better labor conditions were common, and the police or the army would kill hundreds of workers. The Republicans, who were in charge for most of these years, often took the blame, and the Democrats could reliably point at them and say, "Look how bad these guys are, you should vote for us." This strategy has been a Democratic Party staple in every election since. Over time, the parties began to change, with the Republicans becoming more associated as the party for big business, and the Democrats being seen as more sympathetic to workers. And for some workers, this strategy worked. For others, however, they chose the path of organizing themselves into trade unions and working class third parties. For Democrats, Republicans, and the billionaires who backed them, this yet again posed another threat. But this time, the Democrats, who for the last 50 years had posed themselves as the solution to the workers' problems caused by the Republicans, were able to redirect this anger and class solidarity and ultimately neutralize it. In an article written by American political scientist Mike Davis titled The Barren Marriage of American Labor and the Democratic Party, Davis explains how the Democrats were able to neutralize American anti capitalist sentiments and how they continue to do so to this day. I highly recommend you read it for yourself, but for now, I will summarize some of the points he makes. Leading up to the Great Depression, worker militancy and solidarity was becoming more and more popular. Workers were openly talking about communism, and gangs of unemployed people were being formed to meet the needs of their communities by force, stealing food from warehouses and fighting against the police and landlords to prevent evictions. Then, in 1932, FDR, a Democrat running on a much more pro worker, pro reform base, won the presidential election in a landslide. His New Deal policies made him popular with the working class, and in 1935, workers had officially won the right to organize into industrial trade unions and to strike. The American Federation of Labor, one of America's oldest labor organizations, had for a very long time followed a more conservative approach towards labor organizing, being extremely racist not only to black people but to European immigrants as well, opposing strikes, and preferring to organize only specialized craft workers instead of industrial workers. Eventually, some members within the AFL got tired of this old approach to labor organizing and split from the AFL to form the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. This new organization would be much more radical and successful in the labor movement than many expected. It called for mass strikes across industries, had different unions work together to apply pressure on the same companies, and even sued members of the government, such as the Democrat mayor of Jersey City, Frank Hague, for anti-labor repression. Members within the CIO ranged from communists to recently arrived immigrant laborers and black people who were allowed to organize in the CIO's non-segregated worker unions. As the CIO and workers gained more and more rights, they continued becoming more and more radical. But where would all this passion, the solidarity for their other workers, end up? Where would it be directed to? At that moment, the CIO was hugely popular among workers, and the leaders eventually had to make a choice. Would the CIO continue to rely on the goodwill of the Democrats and their New Deal policies, or would they channel all the support into a new third party, a party truly built by and for workers? Unfortunately, the CIO had chosen to rely on the Democrats. In 1943, the CIO PAC, or the CIO Political Action Committee, was formed to officially promote and encourage CIO members to vote for and support the Democratic Party. Initially, some of their motivations were good. The CIO believed that with their massive support for the Democrats, all the supporters of the New Deal, labor organizers, and the more progressive Democrats could reform the party from the inside and push them to the left. But that is not what ended up happening. During the 1944 elections, it was clear to everyone that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in bad health, and whoever his vice president was would likely become the next president. FDR's vice president for his previous term was Henry Wallace, and although he was popular among voters for his support for more pro-labor policies, he was not well liked among Democratic Party officials. Wallace was a supporter of the New Deal, advocated for ending segregation, and was, in the eyes of the Democrats, too friendly with the Soviet Union. A person like this could not be allowed to become the President of the United States, So the Democratic Party convinced Truman, a much more conservative, run-of-the-mill Democrat, to run for vice president. Everyone had believed that Wallace would win this race, and in the first round of voting, he did beat Truman by more than 100 votes. But by pulling favors with voters and encouraging support for Truman, Wallace lost in the second round. The CIO, not wanting to get off on the wrong foot with the Democratic Party, made no attempt to apply pressure on Roosevelt for the Wallace candidacy. By 1945, FDR was dead, and with Wallace and other supporters of the New Deal's pro-labor policies out of the picture, Truman was the President of the United States. Now, the Democrats and FDR had supported these pro-labor policies and the New Deal out of necessity, not out of principle. With the growing popularity of communism, a growing population of people unemployed or in poverty, and dwindling working conditions, everyone knew something needed to be done. In order to save capitalism, FDR and the Democrats introduced some minor reforms to housing, to workers' rights, and to the power of unions. But that's all it ever was. A temporary measure to quell popular discontent and to prevent another third Labor Party from forming. But now that the Depression was over, now that the war was gone, instead of consolidating that power that workers temporarily had in the US and pushing for a third party, one whose primary goal was to serve and to better the conditions of workers, all of this passion was instead put back into the Democratic Party. What followed after the formation of the CIO-PAC and the election of Truman was the complete destruction of the United States' most popular labor movements and the repealing of rights gained by workers at the hands of the Democratic Party. Just 2 years after the end of the Second World War, Republicans introduced the Taft-Hartley Act, directly targeting the rights gained by workers in the New Deal. In an instant, the rights that workers had relied on to build their movements were taken from them. Employees of the federal government had lost the right to strike if a strike caused serious problems to trade, commerce, transportation, transmission, or communication. The President of the United States can declare it a national emergency and force strikers to return to work if a business or an employer had signed an agreement with the labor union stating that they would only hire unionized workers. That agreement was made illegal, and in certain instances, unions now had to ask the government for permission to strike, and couldn't really do anything when they said no. And although the Taft-Hartley Act was proposed by Republicans, it was only passed because of massive Democratic Party support. From the end of the 1940s onwards, Republican and Democratic Party policies would begin to overlap more and more. In 1947, Truman was again running for president, and the leaders of the CIO had strongly supported him. However, within the CIO, many people had different ideas. Unhappy with how the Democrats had basically done nothing while Taft-Hartley was passed, and no longer seemed to be supporting worker strikes or demands for better conditions, much of the CIO's most radical members had wanted to support Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's more sympathetic to labor vice president before Truman, who was running as a third-party candidate. The Democrats had for the past few years been side by side with Republicans, accusing Wallace and many of the more radical and left-wing labor unions within the CIO of being communists, and instead of moving the Democrats further to the left like the CIO had originally intended, in allying with the Democrats, the CIO had to move further right. The CIO leadership accused leftists and communists within the trade union of splitting the vote and making Truman lose. The president of the CIO, Philip Murray, publicly condemned Wallace and those that voted for him, stating, "The Communist Party is directly responsible for the creation of the third party in the United States." It wouldn't take long for the CIO to start dismantling itself. In an attempt to keep the CIO as pro-democracy as possible, not only individual communists, but entire unions that were too sympathetic to communism or to Wallace were expelled. Not only did the CIO make it harder to coordinate strikes and actions across unions, but when possible, it actively ununionized some of its most radical unions. The United Electrical Workers was the third largest union within the CIO, and it was one of its most radical. So in an effort to get on the good side of the Democrats, the CIO took the United Electrical Workers and forcefully dissolved it into 80 smaller different unions, effectively killing it completely. By the time the elections came around, Truman won, and Wallace had barely received 3% of what remained of the CIO's vote. So after basically disemboweling itself to show support for the Democratic Party, did Truman and the other Democrats return the favor? No. Discussions of national health care and the repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act, two campaign promises the Democrats ran on, were dropped completely, as were early plans for affordable public housing. By 1950, the United States was bombing Korea and the Cold War was in full swing. The American government was more anti-communist than ever, and even through all the expulsions and the attempts to prove loyalty to the Democrats, the CIO could never escape the accusations of being Soviet-aligned. Under Truman's second term, workers continued to lose, and what was just less than a decade earlier one of America's strongest and most radical labor organizations, a force that the establishment actually felt threatened by, was rendered completely defenseless. By the next presidential election, a Republican would be back in office, and what was left of the CIO limped back to the AFL and was reabsorbed into the same conservative right wing organization that it had broken free of 20 years earlier. This new organization they founded, the AFL CIO, still exists today, but to even compare it to what the CIO was in the late 30s and early 40s would be a joke. It is essentially there as a wing of the Democratic Party, a labor organization in name only, which comes out every 4 years, endorses the Democratic nominee, and then retreats back to hope that this time maybe the Democrat will actually follow through on their campaign promise to help labor out. And the AFL-CIO is an arm of the Democratic Party through and through. It was a strong supporter of the Cold War and continued to act against communists who wanted to organize their workplace. It attacked any leftist unions or left-leaning politicians in Europe and Latin America. It supported the war in Vietnam and was a supporter of segregation until it was banned. And in the modern era, it isn't much better. Within the AFL-CIO are also some of the US's biggest police unions, which are inherently anti-worker. The AFL-CIO has had members go to strikes and scab, replacing the striking workers for cheaper, and has for the entire last 2 years held the liberal position on the genocide, condemning Hamas, calling for a ceasefire, and then unconditionally supporting the Kamala Harris nomination. The AFL-CIO is a shell of its former self, and in its attempt to join the Democratic Party and push it left, the CIO destroyed not only itself, but also the growing labor movement, being completely co-opted into the Democratic Party and doing nothing but standing by as workers have continued to lose. In 20 years, America's most radical labor movements and organizations would be neutralized and co-opted, and it was all done at the hands of the Democratic Party. Now that we've talked about the Democrats' war against the labor movement, I want to briefly touch on some Democratic policies and general trends that they support or claim to support. And where better to start than with the Democratic Party support for segregation? Now, it shouldn't be a surprise that the embittered Democrats who had lost the Civil War were among the strongest supporters for the Jim Crow laws, but it might surprise you how long this support continued. Well into the 60s, under the Kennedy and Johnson administration, civil rights activists were being killed and virtually nothing was done to stop it. Civil rights organizations, such as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, tried to join the Democratic Party but were outright denied membership from the heads of the DNC. Unlike the stories told in American schools, segregation was not ended because of the goodwill of the government, but because of constant riots and protests led by radicals like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. For the entirety of their lifetimes and the protests, the American mainstream hated them and accused them of being anti-American and of being communists. By the time the Civil Rights Act was passed, it was more out of necessity to calm down the riots and less about actual change within the government. I also feel like it's important to mention that almost 75% of the people that voted no on the Civil Rights Act were Democrats. But this, of course, wasn't the end of the civil rights movement. Even into the 70s, Democrats were fighting against practical implementations of the Civil Rights Act. One might think that now that it was legal to do so, allowing white and black children to attend the same schools and drive in the same bus would not be such a big deal, but that was not the case with Joe Biden. Up until the mid-70s, Biden was one of the strongest opponents to a new legislation that would allow black and white children to ride the same bus to the same school, a policy that he would oppose hand in hand with his fellow Democratic Senator Robert Byrd, a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. The track record doesn't get much better when talking about immigration either. Although under Democrats there are certain policies that allow for more legal pathways to enter the US and become a citizen, the reality is that whether under a Democrat or a Republican, the United States policy on immigration is brutal. According to the Cato Institute, an organization which is itself a very liberal, pro-capitalist, pro-America think tank, legal immigration to the US is virtually impossible, and that today, fewer than 1% of people who want to move permanently to the United States can do so legally. The US legal immigration system is extremely restrictive. By design, it excludes the vast majority of potential immigrants. The basic presumption of the current legal immigration system is that no one may immigrate legally unless they fall into very narrow exceptions. And this analysis was written under Biden's term as president, not Trump's. The difference between naturalization between Democrats and Republicans is also not as wide as you might think. Under Trump, around 3 million immigrants became naturalized US citizens. Under Biden, that number rose to just 3.3 million. And when looking at deportations, the picture doesn't get any better. The rate of deportations under Biden and Obama were both higher than Trump's first term, and from the looks of it, Kamala Harris would not have been much better.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border. There are legal methods by which migration can and should occur.
Even with the videos that are constantly coming out now of ICE soldiers being more brazen, arresting people at their immigration appointments and dragging people off the street, there are connections between Democrats and the Trump administration. A member of the Biden administration has come out in support of Trump's plan to deport legal US residents and withhold visas from pro-Palestine students, wishing only that it be done more deftly. In addition, Tom Homan, Trump's border czar, who is a big supporter of his mass deportation policies, ICE's current actions in the US, and known as the intellectual father of the policy of separating children and their parents at the border, didn't get his start under Trump, but was actually the head of ICE under Obama. In an interview given after Obama had awarded Homan with the Presidential Rank Award, he stated, "Thomas Homan deports people, and he's really good at it." It is undeniable that in the current moment, ICE is being much more open about what they have always been doing, and that this unrestricted power has resulted in these massive protests. But we should remember that just because the news stops reporting on it when a Democrat is in office doesn't mean that forced deportations and people in cages on the border stop happening. It doesn't seem like Trump will change his mind on deportations and ICE anytime soon. But what remains to be seen is whether the next Democrat president will reverse any of his policies, or, as they did with the CIO, neutralize the anger with the bare minimum reforms, get everyone used to this new normal, and then open the door for the next Republicans. Likewise with immigration, healthcare is another topic that many people claim Democrats are better on, but the track record doesn't back them up. Let's start first with abortion. Every 4 years, the topic of abortion is brought up during campaigning, and then quietly dropped once actually in power. And supporting the idea of abortion is good and all, but what have Democrats actually done? Obama ran on a pro-choice platform, but once in office, even with a Democratic supermajority, nothing was done to codify it, which would have solved the issue once and for all. Later, he would give an interview where he said abortion rights were not his top priority, and for the remaining 7 years of his presidency, the legal status of abortion remained unchanged. Until, of course, under Biden's presidency, where Roe v. Wade was repealed and abortion was made illegal in several states. Recent polling has revealed that around 86% of Americans believe abortion should be legal in certain circumstances, a majority of people believe abortion is morally okay, and that even in red states, most people support abortion being legal. And yet, year after year, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in office, whether it's a majority Democrat or Republican in the Senate, access to abortion and other reproductive care keeps slipping away. If you actually care about abortion rights, you should support someone who will actually work towards legalizing it, and not people who just use it as a campaign slogan. For the rest of healthcare, the picture is similarly grim. Let's start with Obama. Under his administration, Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, was signed into law. This was meant to be a big reform to the American healthcare system, but what actually changed? Obamacare allowed more people who previously couldn't find insurance to find insurance, and it set caps on monthly healthcare payments. That's good and all, but it puts the focus on treating the symptoms of America's healthcare problem and not the disease itself. Sure, it is a problem that monthly payments were too high and that people with pre existing conditions couldn't find any health insurance. But all of these problems stem out of how American healthcare is set up, a privatized for profit system where everyone loses except the people who own the businesses and the hospitals. In addition to these benefits, Obamacare now made it a requirement to have this newly accessible private insurance under the threat of paying penalty fees, with a few exceptions. This bill makes more sense when you realize that the Affordable Care Act was actually written in collaboration with the heads of insurance and pharmaceutical companies. And those companies have actually made more money off of the people who were finally allowed to get healthcare than they lost putting caps on monthly payments. Similarly, under Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, putting caps on insulin, drugs for senior citizens, and the amount families had to spend on health insurance. These are good things, but again, they don't treat the core problem. That's why almost a year after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, the percentage of US adults who cannot afford healthcare has reached its highest point since 2021, with 1 in 3 adults not being able to access healthcare that they can afford. Instead of addressing the core problem with the healthcare system, Democrats again choose to focus on small concessions to the American working class, something that will let them feel like someone in the government is actually looking out for them. And yet, the situation on the ground keeps getting worse and worse. When it comes to foreign policy, Republicans and Democrats are arguably more united than ever. Whether the Cold War, the war in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, both Democrats and Republicans have supported virtually every war the United States has been involved in, and the US is very commonly bipartisan when it comes to foreign policy. Today, support for Israel's genocide and growing hostility towards China remains unchallenged attitudes by both parties, despite neither really being all that popular with the citizens of the US themselves. Even a guy like Trump, who is an unashamed imperialist, is not doing things that are so out of the ordinary from what Biden was already doing and setting up. For example, many of you may have heard that under Trump, the US and Ukraine have signed a deal in which the US will now get rights to Ukraine's mineral, oil, and gas resources. Clearly, this is an example of the US using a war to make money and to exploit a country that is in no position to resist, considering that Ukraine relies on American support to continue fighting. But the US was already making money off of the war under Biden's term. When the US sends aid to Ukraine, it isn't just sending them money, it is paying billions of dollars to private weapons companies, companies which are owned and invested in by members of the US government, for the companies to send weapons. And then this money that the US government paid its own companies is used by Trump as an excuse for this mineral deal. And in 2022, the US actively pushed for the EU to impose harsher and harsher sanctions on Russia, causing most of them to become reliant on much more expensive gas from the US. Taking advantage of war has always been the United States' goal, and both Trump and Biden have been on that path since the beginning. Listen to this interview given by Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrat Elizabeth Warren about Ukraine during Biden's term.
People ask me, is it worth it? Here's what we've gotten for our investment. We haven't lost one soldier. We reduced the combat power of the Russian army by 50%, and not one of us has died in that endeavor. This is a great deal for America.
We have to have confidence that the dollars we're spending are actually being spent in defense of the nation. All of that is important, but that's why we're here.
What did Trump do to get the weapons flowing? He created a loan system. They're sitting on 10 to 12 trillion dollars of critical minerals in Ukraine. They could be the richest country in all of Europe. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That 10 to 12 trillion dollars of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal how Ukraine ends. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine to give Putin 10 or 12 trillion dollars of critical minerals that he will share with China is ridiculous.
Warren doesn't contradict any of Graham's points, and his analysis is very clear. It is in America's best interest for Ukrainians to die instead of Americans. It is also, as he states in the second clip, in America's best interest for Ukraine to win, for those very same minerals that Trump would later buy from Zelensky. This attitude was clear from day one, even under the Biden administration. And it isn't just foreign policy where Democrats and Republicans work together as well. If you weren't surprised to hear about Trump's border czar being Obama's former head of ICE, you might also be surprised that George Soros, famously accused by the Republicans as being the billionaire bogeyman behind the Democratic Party, also has some connections to the Republicans themselves. Scott Bessent, Trump's current Secretary of the Treasury, worked with George Soros for 20 years. There are only so many billionaires in the United States, and they are all involved in politics. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter that Soros is a Democrat and Bessent is a Republican. They are both billionaires and are both doing what they think will benefit all of them. It was common for liberals who wanted to feign concern for Palestinians to say that we should vote Democrat because the Republicans would be worse for Palestinians. Biden and other Democrats would come on stage, give a little speech about how there are too many people getting killed in Gaza, and that Israel should let aid trucks pass, promise everyone they were working towards a ceasefire, and nothing would come of it. This was, of course, all a lie. After Trump was back in office, Israeli officials came out and said, God did the state of Israel a favor that Biden was the president during this period. We fought in Gaza for over a year, and the administration never came to us and said, ceasefire now. It never did, and that's not to be taken for granted. Every single time Biden and Harris came out on stage and said they were working tirelessly towards a ceasefire, they were lying.
And she is working tirelessly to secure a ceasefire in Gaza and bringing hostages home.
I will say this, the president and I are working around the clock. We've got to get a hostage deal done and get a ceasefire done now.
Now, to most people, this wasn't a surprise at all. Biden's message seemed to be completely contradicting what he was actually doing, which was unconditionally supporting and financing the genocide in Gaza. But to many Americans, looking like you're doing something and actually doing something is the same thing. And this is how it is virtually every single time. From segregation to Vietnam to Iraq to Gaza, it is never the Democrats versus the Republicans. It is always the Democrats and the Republicans against us. And the reason behind this is extremely simple as well. Both of these parties are funded by billionaires because at the end of the day, they both serve capital in different ways. But what's good for American capital and American billionaires is not usually what is good for the average American. Actually, it's pretty bad. I really like this quote from anti-colonialist revolutionary Julius Nyerere that goes, "The United States is also a one-party state, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them." Earlier, we talked about how during the Civil War, the Democrats supported slavery because their form of organizing the economy was how the wealthy people who funded them made their wealth, and the Republicans supported abolishing slavery because the industrialists who funded them knew they could make more money that way. But once slavery was over, the Reconstruction period had passed, and the US had become one of the most powerful countries in the world following the Second World War. Capital had accumulated to a point that this contradiction between the two parties ceased to exist. They don't serve either industrialists or plantation owners anymore. They serve capital. There are differences in the parties for sure. Socially speaking, Republicans lean more conservative and Democrats lean more liberal. Nothing I'm saying is new there. But at the end of the day, both of these political parties do not work towards our best interests. They make money for the people that fund them, and more often than not, that money is taken in one way or another from you or from somebody else around the globe. And the liberal or conservative dress up reasoning for what they are doing is added after the fact to appeal to two broad groups of Americans. Whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, wars keep happening, people keep getting deported, police keep killing people, more people lose out on healthcare and affordable living spaces, and wealth keeps moving upwards. Voting Democrat will not fix this problem, organizing in and supporting Labor parties will. Now that I've talked about the Democratic Party more generally, I wanted to briefly talk about some Democrat presidents we've had and what they've actually done. And I'll start with Jimmy Carter because I'm almost certain nobody watching this video was alive when Kennedy or Johnson were presidents, but I did want to mention something interesting that I found out while researching for this video. Did you know that Harry Truman was a member of the KKK? Apparently, he didn't do anything with them and got into a fight with a couple Klan members after the fact, but it was still surprising to find out that he went to Klan meetings with his friends and then paid to join them because he thought it would help his chances as a Democrat. Anyway, like I said, I wanted to start with Jimmy Carter, who was the president following Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Now, under Nixon and Ford, the US had fought in Vietnam, and by the time it was Carter's turn, people were tired of the war, and politicians were beginning to pretend that they had been against it all along. Jimmy's entire campaign was basically, I am not Nixon or Ford, their leadership led us to war, and I won't do that. 20 years after he has stopped being the president, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian work. Now, while a lot of his humanitarian work post-presidency was good, his record while in office was not the change he had promised, nor was it very humanitarian. Instead of moving American politics away from war, Carter actually increased the military's budget by $10 billion while in office. His administration also continued the path of Nixon and Ford by supporting not only financially but politically the dictatorships of Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo, Suharto in Indonesia, the Shah of Iran, and the growing amount of dictators in Latin America such as Pinochet in Chile, Alfredo Stroessner in Paraguay, and Somoza in Nicaragua. On top of this, he continued the long-standing democratic tradition of crushing labor movements, threatening to call the National Guard on a group of striking miners in the late 70s. He also formed organizations whose explicit purpose was to train scabs to break strikes, something that the next president, Ronald Reagan, would do when he fired thousands of air traffic controllers who were on strike and replaced them with Jimmy Carter's trained scabs. After the years of Reagan and Bush Sr., the deficit spending was too high, so Bill Clinton was brought in to fix the budget, as he's remembered nowadays. Now that the Soviet Union had collapsed, there were less and less reasons to keep around programs like welfare, social housing, and food stamps, at least in the form that they were available in the US before the collapse. With no more threat to capital, capital had no reason to continue giving out concessions. Under Clinton, cuts to welfare, social housing, food stamps were severe. Some of these programs were eliminated completely, others lost up to $10 billion in funding. With the introduction of Clinton's three-strike policies imposing mandatory life sentences even in cases where the judge didn't agree, and an increase in the funding towards prison construction that outpaced what was given to universities, by the end of Clinton's term, the prison population had exploded. In addition to saving money by cutting social services and sending people to prisons, the US government also made money under Clinton, becoming the world's largest arms dealer, which it still is to this day. And of course, Clinton wouldn't be a change towards peace either. Under his presidency, he supported dictators such as Alberto Fujimori in Peru, who would end up committing genocide against Peru's indigenous population, supported Boris Yeltsin's attack on Russia's parliament, and supported NATO's bombing of Serbia and Kosovo. After Clinton came Bush, and I think most people watching actually remember this time period and of course the Iraq War. Like the war in Vietnam and the genocide in Gaza, both Democrats and Republicans were united in support for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Although they would have slight disagreements over how the war should be conducted, one thing remained constant. They would always vote in support of sending more money and more weapons. Many may remember the Patriot Act as a uniquely Republican bill, which, among other things, allowed the US government to accuse its own citizens of being terrorists and imprison them without convicting them of a crime. But it was signed into law by a majority Democrat Congress with bipartisan support. And then, by the end of Bush's term, came the 2008 financial crisis. After 2 expensive wars and the collapse of the US housing market, it was time for another Democrat to step in, promising once again a real change. Obama was the first president that I consciously remember actually being elected and knowing what that meant. In my school, my teachers told me that Obama was a devil from Kenya, but despite that, you couldn't escape the feeling that something important had changed. From my parents to other adults, even South Park had an episode about it, there was this feeling that Obama was going to be a real change. But clearly, he did not live up to those expectations. The warning sign started with his campaign when he announced Joe Biden to be his vice president. Now, for all the new that Obama represented, Biden was about as cookie-cutter of a Democratic politician as you could get. But we'll talk more about him in a bit. Another sign that Obama was not what he was made out to be was who funded his campaign. Obama was brought in to fix the financial crisis, which was caused by banks who had been loaning out money to people they knew could not pay it back. So people should have taken it as a warning that some of the banks that caused the problem, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, and the like, had donated millions to Obama's campaign. In office, Obama would continue Bush's path of giving billions in bailouts to some of the banks that had caused the crisis in the first place. Millions of people lost their homes, the cost of food kept rising, and by the end of Obama's 2 terms, the amount of children who relied on food stamps had doubled. Under Obama, funding for ICE was raised significantly, and the amount of people deported under him quickly outpaced that of any previous president. While campaigning, Obama used labor unions, human rights groups, and women's rights groups to promise that he would codify abortion, shut down the torture center built on illegally occupied land in Cuba, and support legislation that would make it easier to unionize. All of those were dropped once in office. Another thing that was dropped under Obama's time in office were tens of thousands of bombs on Iraqi weddings and Yemeni children, one of the highest rates of bombings of any US president. Under Obama, the military budget reached $720 billion, money that was used to spread war in Iraq, in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Libya, and Afghanistan. And then came Biden. Serving for decades in the US government has afforded Biden a lot of opportunities, from supporting segregated buses to Reagan's war on drugs and economic policies, to Clinton's budget cuts, to the war in Iraq, and ultimately the genocide in Gaza. There was barely a war crime, a dictator, or an attack on the working class that Biden couldn't get behind during his career. Even his support of Israel killing civilians has a long track record. In the 80s, while Israel was killing civilians in Lebanon, Biden expressed his approval to the then Prime Minister Menachem Begin when he said, "It had to be done. If attacks were launched from Canada into the United States, everyone here would have said, attack all the cities of Canada, and we don't care if all the civilians get killed." And where did it get him? After years in office, Biden will undoubtedly be remembered for the last thing he did: support and fund a genocide. I could talk about his economic policy, his inability to protect reproductive rights, that he deported more people than Trump, the accusations of sexual assault and unwanted touching, but all of that really pales in comparison to genocide, doesn't it? I mean, that's about the worst thing a person or a country could do. Despite the differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the reality is that they are much more alike than most people are comfortable admitting. From bipartisan support for wars, genocides, and dictators to supporting some of the Republicans' most right-wing policies and laws, like Bush's Patriot Act, to Reagan's economic policies and strike-breaking, to using each other's heads of ICE or Secretary of the Treasury, to accepting money from the same political action communities or billionaire donors, these two parties represent these same interests. The only difference being the wrapping paper that it comes in. The Democratic Party is one of the most important components of the American machine because for every struggle that remains unaddressed by the Republican Party, whether it's women's rights, gay rights, the labor struggle, Black Lives Matter, the Democrats can incorporate it into their party, provide lip service, and continue like nothing has happened. And I think this is encapsulated in Bernie Sanders. I spent a lot of time in this video talking about the CIO and how their attempt to ally with the Democrats eventually ended up destroying them. Despite this lesson being very clear as day, Bernie Sanders has attempted to repeat the mistakes of the CIO. Bernie is seen as this very left-wing guy in American politics, someone who could really shake the system up. I think he is not nearly as radical as some people make him out to be, but that's not the point of this video. Bernie has been an independent for most of his career, and technically still is, except in the last 10 years, he's grown closer and closer to the Democratic Party. Whatever criticisms he has of the Democrats, it hasn't stopped him of supporting them and their politicians repeatedly for the last 10 years, even as they are doing genocide. But instead of his allying with them causing them to move more to the left and be more open to the policies that he supports, the Democrats keep moving to the right, and with it, the positions that he keeps supporting by repeatedly endorsing Democrats. Bernie himself as a politician also really reminds me of what the Democrats actually do within the American political consciousness as well. For example, Bernie has been a lifelong fan of American socialist Eugene Debs, a politician who tried to run as a communist for president in the early 1900s and who was a supporter of the growing labor movement. He's even made a documentary about him and has given interviews about what we can learn from him. So let's quote Eugene Debs here. "There is no hope under the present decaying system. The worker who votes the Republican or the Democratic ticket does worse than throw his vote away. He is a deserter of his class and his own worst enemy." As often happens, Debs' real criticism of the American political system and support for a more militant labor movement, one that is hostile towards the Democrats, is co-opted by Sanders, who constantly encourages people to vote Democrat and constantly supports their stances. Just a short while ago during the ICE protests, Bernie, like many other Democrats, came out on Twitter to condemn the protesters for using violence against the police, and bizarrely uses Martin Luther King Jr. as an excuse for peaceful demonstrations. With all due respect to Dr. King, he did not single-handedly win black people their civil rights. His movement was supported by and worked with other civil rights movements, many of which were much more militant and violent than he was, and MLK understood this himself. In a letter he wrote while in prison, he says, "I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have reached almost the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with you in your methods of direct action.'" This quote, I think, sums it up very well who Sanders is and the Democratic Party today as a whole. And when you put it all together, the fact that the most radical politician in the US today is a guy who supports Democratic candidates even when they are doing genocide, has the police arrest people with Palestinian flags at his rallies, and condemns violent protests against the police and ICE, is quite pathetic. There's another dimension to this as well. Sanders has tried to get the Democratic presidential nomination twice now, in 2016 and 2020. But the Democratic National Convention, which votes on the Democratic presidential nomination, is not quite as democratic as people would think. American citizens get to vote every 4 years between Democrat and Republican. But we don't actually choose who the candidates are, the DNC and the RNC do, and how they choose is arguably more important than how the American public ends up choosing. For example, we earlier talked about how for FDR's third term, Henry Wallace was supported for being his vice president. He was the most popular and he even received the most votes. But members of the DNC didn't like his pro-labor, anti-segregation policies and actively worked to suppress his campaign for vice president. Truman's biographer David McCollough writes, "But Hannigan, Flynn, Kelly, and the others had been working throughout the night, talking to delegates and applying a good deal of pressure to help them see the sense in electing Harry Truman. No one knows how many deals were cut, how many ambassadorships or postmaster jobs were promised, but reportedly by the time morning came, Postmaster General Frank Walter had telephoned every chairman of every delegation. And those names in the beginning of the quote refer to Robert Hannigan, the Democratic National Chairman, Edward Flynn, the former chairman of the DNC and one of the most politically connected people in New York, and Edward Kelly, the mayor of Chicago. So in order to steer the party away from going into a direction that the head of the DNC didn't want, a direction that would have been more pro-union, more against segregation, and not as hostile towards the Soviet Union, heads of the Democratic Party got together and planned to have a popular candidate replaced, either by offering voters advancements in their career, by offering other types of bribes, and in some circumstances, literally just telling nominees to drop out of the race and to tell their supporters to support Truman. And this isn't the only time the DNC had to suppress a popular candidate to keep the party on the path of its billionaire funders. During the war in Vietnam, the Democratic Party was a strong supporter of the war, but by 1968, some people were starting to get tired, and within the Democrats' voter base, more support was given to the candidate that was more critical of the war, Eugene McCarthy. But this, of course, wouldn't be allowed by the DNC. True to the voters, a group of anti-war delegates proposed a plank to the Platform Committee calling for de-escalation in Vietnam along the lines proposed by McCarthy and Kennedy. But the Platform Committee endorsed a pro-war plank and pushed this through on the floor a few days later. Then, on Wednesday, August 29th, although anti-war candidates McCarthy and Kennedy had received the vast majority of the primary votes cast, convention delegates, handpicked by party machine leaders, nominated pro-war Hubert Humphrey for president. This is also what happened not even 10 years ago, where despite being a popular candidate, Bernie Sanders' bid for presidency was suppressed in favor of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton had signed an agreement a year before the 2016 National Convention in which, in exchange for raising money and investing in the DNC, Hillary would control the party's finances, strategy, and all the money raised. Her campaign had the right of refusal of who would be the party communications director, and it would make final decisions on all the other staff. I hope I don't have to explain how having a potential nominee funding and controlling the party strategy and staff is a conflict of interest. That line, by the way, comes from a book written by Donna Brazile, chair of the Democratic National Committee, who got her job after the previous chair, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, resigned because emails leaked revealing that she and many other heads of the DNC were collaborating in an effort to prevent Sanders' nomination. Unsurprisingly, her replacement, who was supposed to fix the corruption, was also implicated in the leaked emails, which showed her sharing debate questions with the Clinton campaign in the upcoming primary. After stepping down later, Donna Brazile, former head of the Democratic National Committee, found a job at none other than Fox News. I also want to point out that in the emails, a member of the DNC referred to Bernie Sanders as a Jew and said that they would try to portray him as an atheist so that more religious voters wouldn't support his campaign. These have been only 3 examples of what I'm sure is many more that highlight that even when a candidate is popular with voters, such as Henry Wallace, Eugene McCarthy, or Bernie Sanders, if that person doesn't align themselves with what the party heads and billionaire funders want, then they don't get the nomination. And this is exactly why people need to be careful with the Democratic Party, because if anybody does manage to get the nomination, that's because the party heads and financiers think that they will serve them. As the US standard of living continues to drop, the Democratic Party will begin to roll out candidates that appear radical, that will say some of the right things. But anyone who has gone through the DNC's election process and has actually secured the nomination is not someone who is against the establishment. They are very much a part of it. America is, as the Julius Nyerere quote I used earlier puts it, a one-party state with 2 parties. Both of these parties are right-wing parties that are beholden to their class interests, and no matter what voters support, the only people who are put on the ballot are people who have proven their loyalty to the wealthiest of Americans, the people who fund their parties and their careers. Both the Republicans and the Democrats serve the owning class in different ways, and this faith that Americans have in the Democratic Party is killing any movement towards a future party that actually is made up by the working class, the majority of Americans whose lives get worse no matter who the president is. Everything that America is and has been, from slavery to wars all over the world to the repression of the labor movement to support for dictators from Asia to Latin America to funding and participating in genocide in both the past and present, the Democratic Party has been a part of. Not as an observer, not as someone trying to fix the country, but as an active and enthusiastic participant. This video is about the Democratic Party, so I don't want to get too off topic here, but a lot of people might be watching and wondering, what is to be done? Well, the first step should always be to organize yourself and get to know people in the real world. The second, as I hope to have demonstrated in this video, is that America, but also other European countries to be honest, need a separate party for workers. When you vote for a Democrat, you're voting for America to stay as it is, an imperialist, white supremacist country that is not only the world's chief exporter of weapons, but also of genocides and war crimes. It all stops when Americans stop allowing themselves the comfort of being completely removed from the political reality of not only their poorer neighbors, but also of people around the entire world. Whatever organization you join doesn't even need to start as a party, really. It could be a local tenant or labor union, a political group that you agree with, things that could, in some hypothetical future, work towards the founding of a party. There are these moments that happen every few years in the US, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the BLM protests, the Gaza protests, the anti-ICE protests, where there are thousands of people who get out on the streets and riot, which is good and all. But there's really no organization behind it. There's no demands. There's no real way to put pressure on the government. But now imagine we had a nationwide organization of tenant unions, labor unions, leftist political groups who can join these movements and say, on top of the protests, we will not work or pay rent or what have you, and these are our demands. And that becomes much harder for the government to ignore. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. This has been a lot longer of a video than I was expecting it to be, and it honestly could have still been a lot longer. But I hope by the time the next elections come around that more people are being critical of the American electoral process. If you'd like to support me, you can find me at Patreon or at Buy Me a Coffee, and I'd like to thank all my supporters, Finn Hammock, Dirk K, Cal, CMP6408, Dooley, Almudena Carrasco Pasos, Gabio Nontesi, and Dangerman1973. Thank you all for the support. It really does make a difference. I'm gonna go see some family in a short while for the first time in a year, but once I'm back from this mini break, I'll be back and we'll be talking about deportations.